to Undercurrent News and our series of interviews, and I'm delighted to welcome today the team at DNB, and Hvistendahl, the head of seafood, and Dag Sletmo as well. Thanks very much for joining me, and we're going to talk a lot about salmon today, the salmon industry. And I guess my first question to you both is, we've seen a lot of consolidation recently. We've seen SalMar being active. We've seen the NRS as well, and even in Australia, Huon Aquaculture. What do you think is driving this consolidation right now in salmon?
Would you like to start, Dag, or should I say, you know, of course, I mean, all of this actually has an industrial angle. You know, that there are fewer and stronger companies in UK. That is a good thing. We've also historically seen consolidation in Chile. We have seen the same in North America, and also in Norway here, where I think NRS, they started by selling out their southern part, and then you get a better industrial entity in the south of Norway. And then you can see that there are plans for a new consolidated company, perhaps both NRS and Salmon Nord and Midtnorsk Havbruk joining forces.
Right. And do you think this is being driven by the price environment or the recovery in the markets after the pandemic, which clearly affected all of these producers, with food service shutting down?
I think that maybe like, you know, the sort of salmon price movements within a year doesn't mean that much, but it could maybe mean, you know, if you look at the stock market, it's been a little bit volatile, but you know, it's been a certain range for quite some while, meaning buyers and sellers kind of agreed, I guess, a bit on what the fair price level is. Then you get, you know, when you get transactions, you also get reference points for, you know, for other potential deals. So it might be easier for buyers and sellers to agree. And then I think, you know, maybe some of this activity is almost a little bit random in the sense that, you know, you have underlying drivers that imply that there should be more consolidation. You know, even if it's sometimes difficult to see the economies of scale in farming, you know, we do see that they are increasing, maybe especially related to infrastructure. We also see that there's, you know, been a bigger variation in biological results. So like if you're a small company operating only one area, that can actually be kind of a bit risky. It can be good to be maybe a little bit bigger. But you also see that, you know, this activity kind of comes in bouts, so to speak. Like, you know, a few years ago, there was a lot of activity in Chile. We've been waiting for it for many years. Finally, it happened, and it's been very quiet in Norway. And then suddenly now there's a lot of activity in Norway. And as you mentioned, also, you know, Scotland and Tasmania.
Right. Do you think as well that actually in Chile it has been quiet, and I guess they've lived through the pandemic in a different way, because the American market which they serve is quite different, and it was much more food service based, except that now it seems that Americans have learned how to cook salmon at home in large numbers. Do you think that's changed the picture for Chileans, and perhaps we'll see more consolidation?
I guess, you know, scary events can always make people think differently. I think, you know, COVID was more scary for the Chilean producers for the reason you mentioned. They took a much bigger hit to prices than operators in Europe. But, you know, at the same time, you know, we have seen a good bit of consolidation in Chile, so it's difficult to say. Right.
No, that's great. So what's your outlook for the market right now in general for salmon? I think going into the pandemic, it seemed that salmon was in a structural supply deficit, and these producers in very certain specific parts of the world, you know, obviously produce a limited amount of fish, and it didn't seem to be enough for all of these new growing emerging markets. And then we got the pandemic and food service shut down in many parts of the world. What's the current picture? How does DNB see the market?
Doug, I suppose, but we have seen that the amount of salmon being sold has increased, right? A huge increase in the demand in the US and also in Europe.
Right. And that's been, what do you think are the main drivers for that?
There's been obviously a big push into retail during COVID because it was necessary as food service closed down. And historically, this is often how the market has expanded by periods when prices have been low, entering new markets, reaching new consumers, educating them, and then there's stickiness when the other parts recover. So as food service now is opening up, the retail demand has had a sort of a structural shift because of COVID. So that can actually be a very positive longer term effect of COVID actually.
Right, because the retail sector, I think in 2020 had double-digit gains in most of these major markets, and it seems to have stayed at a higher level. As I think you said, a structural increase in demand in many markets.
Yeah, it's quite natural in many ways, in the sense that often one big barrier for people to buy fish to cook at home, including salmon, is they don't really know how to cook it. So now people have been forced to learn and discover that especially salmon actually is extremely easy to cook if you just know how to do it. And that skill is something that they, of course, will not forget even as society normalizes.
Right. And for DNB, obviously you care a lot about equity markets, but debt as well. What are the financing conditions like at the moment for salmon farmers? I know that some of the big players have recently raised kind of so-called green finance. What's the picture now for these types of financings?
I think it's a bit different, for instance, in Norway towards Chile. In Norway, I mean, prices are really low, and you can see that, like SalMar, they are raising enormous amounts of green money cheaper than they are able to get in banks. Where I think that things are a bit more tricky in Chile, but I think that we have used the pandemic, both to pick up new clients. We have supported the ones that we had, and we have made a lot of facilities, for safety reasons if they should need it. Yeah, and at least in Norway, I think that we are just impressed on how the industry has performed during this crisis. Also, a lot of owners taking responsibility by not paying dividends, things like that. But banks are open to this industry in all markets.
Right. Yeah, and obviously there's salmon farmers, but there's also the supply industry as well, and many companies now are quite large companies that just supply the salmon industry. Are they looked on as well in the same favorable way by the banks?
Yeah, I think so. And there in the supplier industry or the service industry, we have also seen consolidation, for instance, in the wellboat sector, which is important here.
Right. Could we see more consolidation in other parts of the supply chain, do you think?
Yeah, so if we are talking about the supply and the companies around the salmon farmers, it is the feed companies, and then there is the equipment sector, and of course we do think that we started talking about land-based, and if you build land-based or big smolt facilities, these are large investments. So that part of the sector should have very good, yeah, have a nice future. In the wellboats, I don't know. We have seen consolidation.
Right, right.
And then you can see like type of infrastructure players are entering into that sector.
I see.
And I guess we could also add that, you know, in general, you see that, you know, there is the industry is continually becoming more capital intensive. You know, there's new technology that needs more capital than earlier, and like, you know, you get a lot more sort of physical infrastructure. You know, whether it's land based or offshore or semi-closed in sea, etc. You know, so the service part of the industry will probably grow quite fast, and it would be natural that there is a good bit of consolidation because you have a lot of relatively small suppliers that I guess it would be beneficial for them to be bigger, so they get better bargaining power versus the larger salmon farmers, but also so they're able to handle bigger projects and also the risk that comes along with bigger projects. And, you know, maybe also we'll see suppliers from other industries entering this space as it becomes, you know, bigger and more attractive to them.
Could you give an example of sorry, companies that might come from other industries? What types of deals could we possibly see?
Yeah, I think, you know, just conceptually, it could be companies used to handling big projects. So, like, you know, one example would be Aka, who's now joining forces with Salmar in the offshore space.
Right. Okay. Yeah, that's good. And I guess we've seen one of the biggest capex expenditures for all of the salmon farmers, especially in Norway over the last couple of years, have been these mega smolt facilities. And I guess, do you think we'll see that trend continuing? There's been almost several projects commissioned, major projects commissioned every single year. And I guess my other question is, do you think that will actually allow Norway to increase output and deal with the some of the problems such as sea lice?
It seems like, yeah, this is a trend that continues, and that, you know, there are a lot of benefits to bigger smolts, both in terms of increasing capacity and reducing biological risk, and that also, you know, this, like for full cycle, you know, it's a learning curve, and that people are becoming better at running these operations. Sure.
And obviously the big topic whenever people talk about the salmon industry nowadays is the land-based grow out companies. And it's been quite turbulent for that sector. I won't go into specific companies, but what's your view at the moment on the land-based farmers? We've now got several of them on the Norwegian Stock Exchange, and so they're quite they seem to have access to finance, and there's a lot of focus on some of the front runners. What's your view on that sector?
I suppose at least they have a lot of access to equity, right? It's a huge interest around these projects. I think that we have around 100 projects on our list. We will not do all of them, but I think that our governing thought here is that land-based will succeed sooner or later, but perhaps that there will be a bumpy road until you succeed.
Sure. Well, what do you see as the main challenges that they have to resolve for more investors to come in and feel reassured about this new sector?
I guess it's simply, you know, demonstrating that, you know, first, of course, that you can build the facilities kind of, you know, on time and budget, but, you know, most importantly, long term is that, you know, they can actually run them in a good way from a biological perspective, and, you know, get the volumes you're supposed to get, and also then get the unit cost that you are supposed to get. That people simply need to see that demonstrated.
Right, right. I mean, there are obviously one or two Norwegian companies that are building these systems as well. Do you see some companies finding new solutions around the main technology to improve the biology and raise the density levels in these farms?
It seems like the main technological routes are sort of well established. RAS is the dominant part, then you also have flow through, and it's sort of more about tweaking, getting all the details right, rather than one magic technological bullet, so to speak.
Right, right. Yeah, no, that's great. And at the same time, and we've had some news with offshore farming. You did mention the SalMar Aker deal. And I think as well that the Norwegian government wants to introduce a new license regime. Could you talk a little bit about what's happening with offshore?
It seems like offshore so far has been relatively successful. It hasn't been truly offshore. It's been, I guess, an exposed site, and now it's the next move to go further offshore. So I guess the challenge now is to get some of the regulations in place. When you get outside of they get far enough off the coast, the conventional regulation doesn't apply anymore. But then you get into a competition for the space with the oil industry, shipping, offshore wind, fishing, etc. So that stuff need to be sorted out. And then I guess it's just a question of again a little bit sort of trial and error, like in land-based, but that in offshore it's more of a gradual move. While land-based obviously is one big radical step. So in that sense, I guess maybe you can do more incremental improvements in offshore.
Sure. And I think as well, we have these alternative solutions to farming more salmon, such as these closed containment systems or the semi-closed containment systems. Do you see developments of those sectors, and could that become the surprise element in salmon supply?
I think that's a very interesting area. If you look at the technology development, it's been very much focused on land-based and offshore, and people speak less about what's happening to sort of local coastal farming. But obviously there's a lot of potential there also, and closed to semi-closed coastal farming is something people have been kind of working on it for years. There's been technological challenges. It seems like those to a large extent have been solved. And now the Norwegian government, as you know, recently announced that they will look into announcing a special license regime for semi-closed in sea. They actually don't say semi-closed, they don't use that word, they just set technical specifications, but the only technology that could meet those today would be semi-closed. So that could mean that you can achieve two different things. One is to reduce the environmental footprint of where the farming is done already, and the other one is that you will be able to use locations that currently are not suited for farming, but say the water circulation isn't good enough,
right,
etc. So I think for coastal farming communities, this is very important, and that also kind of implies that there will be a high political focus on it. But it's a lot more capital intensive, and also even if the technical issues of the actual cages seem to a large extent has been solved, it'll still be a learning curve on from a biological perspective.
Right. What companies do you think are best poised to take advantage of that if there are new licenses for this type of technology?
I would think a lot of the Norwegian farmers would be very well positioned to do this and would be interested in doing it. And again, when you take land-based and offshore, they are extremely capital intensive, and it's quite different. So it's sort of a little bit of revolutionary changes. This is more incremental in many ways, and sometimes innovation is big, spectacular stuff, but in real life, very often also if you can just do a lot of incremental improvements and already have equally or even more successful.
Right, right. And I think you said on previous occasions that one of the biggest challenges for the salmon sector is growth, isn't it? And it's very difficult for these companies to raise output. Do you see now some of these things on the horizon solving that big challenge of getting more growth, volume growth?
It seems, as Anne said, we believe that land-based will succeed at some point. And it seems like, offshore is also developing the right way. It still would take, a number of years before you have volumes that really become significant in a global scale. But I think, we can say with a pretty high, degree of probability that, this will happen at some point, not in 2 or 3 years, but, maybe in 10 years, it's a significant volume. In 20, it could be, very significant. And you also have the same thing, with the closed coastal farming, and with this new licensing regime that the Norwegian government proposes, this capacity will be in addition to the well-established so-called traffic light system for increasing capacity.
Yeah. Do you think that type of technology allows these farmers to look at other areas? I guess there's obviously Norway, but you could, in some senses, some of these new technologies might even allow the industry to go to new regions where salmon doesn't conventional salmon farming technology is unfeasible.
Yes, to a very large extent. Land-based, it makes sense that most of it will be, in say the US and in Asia. We have the big markets where fish is sent on airplanes today to have them close to the market. Offshore is maybe a little bit less flexible, but there's also a lot of places in the world where you can do offshore also closer to the end markets. When you look at the closed technology, that also is relevant for I would say all existing salmon farming regions globally, and maybe could open up some new ones. But it will be more challenging, say, when you don't get the sort of incentive that you will get, and via cheaper licenses. In a sense, it's an advantage that Norway, as a starting point, has so expensive licenses that you can make a discount on new technology. If you don't get that benefit in other, regulatory regimes, it could be maybe a little bit more difficult to get going. But, if this works well in Norway, and if people see that operating costs can be reduced because of the biological cost, reduced to a degree where it compensates for the higher capital cost, then that barrier would also be removed.
Right. And I guess so much of the expertise is in Norway that it would be beneficial it would, in a sense, this know-how can be exported to other countries via Norwegian companies, right?
Yeah, that's, for the Norwegian industry, it doesn't have to be a problem that the industry becomes sort of more global, can just be an opportunity, just the way that, Norwegian companies are involved in farming in other parts of the country. But of course, for the local Norwegian sort of coastal communities, it's a different story. But, if you look at the shipping industry in Norway, started with Norwegian export of timber. And then we just cut down all the trees. There was no timber export anymore, but we remained very good at shipping. So hopefully the salmon will be different. We'll become very good also in the service industry, but also keep a lot of production at home. Yeah,
that's great. And I guess as well, I mean, one of the interesting things we've seen is the Oslo Stock Exchange in the last year or so has become much more, the seafood sector has really diversified, and we have companies from other parts of the world choosing to list in Oslo. Do you think we'll see that trend continuing?
Will you answer that, Anna?
I suppose we hope so, but yeah, because you have the Icelandic companies, you have Kamchatka, but now you also have other species like kingfish and barramundi at Oslo Stock Exchange. So I suppose the financial community in Oslo with a lot of clever equity analysts is is a good argument for listing in Oslo.
Right, right. That's great. And I guess I'll just do one more question, and then we'll wrap up here. But I think one of the intriguing, we seem to be at this really intriguing point in history in the salmon industry where you have these new technologies, and there are the big producers right now, coastal farmers, and they're looking at both technologies. And I think Moe's Ivan Vinheim has said that they're actually looking at everything. But it seems that the salmon companies have put most of their efforts into offshore and closed containment, and they seem to be a little bit on the fence with land-based grow out. But just recently, there's been one or two deals. I think you've seen some of the, not so much the actual companies themselves, but the owners of the companies investing in land-based, and we saw this week with Colombi Salmon. Do you think that the big producers will eventually get involved with the land-based startups because they are startups in a sense, or will they maybe focus more on offshore? What's your prediction on that one?
Dag, what should we say? At least they are following land-based closely.
Yeah, I think it seems like, I guess a lot of the traditional salmon farmers, used to be very skeptic to full cycle on land, to now a lot of them believing that this will succeed, but it might take some time before it succeeds, and there will be more, mistakes. So, the question, I guess, is, is there an early mover advantage or not? And I think a lot of them feel that they can still wait a little bit, but at some point they, will consider, entering that space themselves.
Right. That's great. Well, again, Anne Hvistendahl and Dag Sletmo, thank you very much for joining us at Undercurrent News, and keep tuned for more really great interviews from the seafood industry. Thank you.